Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is episode 4 of the KMG Show. As I mentioned yesterday, after months of difficulties, my PayPal account has been restored. So those who would like to contribute, the address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. First up, Canada held hostage, day 15. So, what does our Prime Minister I can't help making that mistake. Pierre Trudeau is Prime Minister of Canada for so long that I often confuse him with his nitwit son. Justin Trudeau, who is the Prime Minister of Canada, has been since 2015. He now seems to have reversed his previous position, saying that the barricades must now come down. That previously he talked about dialogue and reconciliation. He says that the injunctions must be obeyed. Canadians who are feeling the very real impact of these blockades are running out of patience. He didn't seem to indicate whether he was personally running out of patience. So this struggle that's going on, which has been linked to the Wet'suwet'en people of British Columbia, there are several things involved. There's Indian activism, there's environmental activism, and there is the role of Western Canada in Confederation. There is a vast project, $21 billion project in northern Alberta, which has been put forward by the company Teck. It's an oil sands mine, and the federal government has not yet approved it. As mentioned before, if they do approve it, the environmentalists will go nuts, screaming that Canada's talk about climate change is all hypocrisy. If this is turned down, then separatism goes right to the top of the charts in Alberta. The Prime Minister's point man, this is from the CBC, for the Prairie, said today the fate of the proposed Teck Frontier oil sands mine will be decided next week, setting the table for another potential showdown over an oil and gas project in this country. Liberal MP Jim Carr said the nearly $21 billion project represents a complex challenge for the federal government, one that demands a balance between the interests of Alberta, which sees the project's thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in revenue as critical to the province's future, and environmentalists, who insist that approving the project would make a mockery of the Trudeau government's international commitments on climate change. I believe that when the decision is made, the arguments will be advanced why it is in the public interest and the national interest, and always and ultimately Canadians will decide if they agree. Ho, ho, very satirical. Canadians are not consulted on the big issues in my country. He insisted that he was not signaling that Cabinet is ready to approve the project, although he acknowledged that the decision the government announces in the coming days, whatever it is, will be a tough sell. It's complex. It's full of issues that are important to Alberta and the country. As always, there are the balances and trade-offs and the consideration of environmental stewardship while living up to international obligations. Canada has committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050, a target that Liberal MP Nathaniel Erskine-Smith insists will remain out of reach if Teck Frontier is approved. Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, if you bought an illustrated dictionary and you looked up the word bugman, you would see a picture of Nathaniel Erskine-Smith. He says there is no clear picture how this project, which lasts until 2067, fits within our net zero commitment. When you look at this project, when you look at the climate commitment specifically, I think it's a pretty easy no. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been warned already about the political risks of killing the project. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has lobbied hard for its approval, warning Trudeau that a rejection could give a boost to separatist sentiments in the province. Kenney wrote to Trudeau earlier this month, here in Alberta, it would be interpreted as a rejection of our most important industry, and it could raise roiling Western alienation to the boiling point something I know your government has been attentive to since the election. The rejection would send a signal to the international investment community that Canada's regulatory system is arbitrary, subject to moving and invisible goalposts, and that even the best evidence can be trumped by narrow politics. The Frontier Mine has received regulatory approval already, even though the review panel concluded that there would be significant adverse environmental effects. Yes, but Alberta is a big province. It is in fact bigger than the entire country of France. The way the oil sands works is that essentially, I don't know, some square miles, 10 square miles more, turned into a toxic waste dump. But as previously noted, Alberta has a lot of space. So the whole world apparently is paying attention to the Canadian government's decision, and the Nobel Prize winners, or some of them, 121, have taken an interest. This from The Guardian. Dear Prime Minister Trudeau and Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, the year 2020 has already become one defined by devastating impacts of climate change. While we celebrated the ambition of countries, including Canada, that demanded the enshrinement of 1.5 degrees Celsius in the Paris Climate Agreement, it is increasingly clear that even this is a compromise with deeply tragic implications for the world's climate vulnerable regions. Yes, weather is not climate. We are told a few weeks ago in Edmonton, Alberta, where I lived for 5 years, the temperature reached minus 41 degrees Celsius, which is pretty much minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit, almost identical. That made Edmonton the coldest city with any significant population in the world. This some years after John Baird, the former Conservative Environment Minister, claimed that winters as we have known them in Canada are coming to an end. What absolute nonsense. Around the time that Edmonton was suffering through this cold wave, Newfoundland was hit with the biggest snowstorm in history, certainly modern history. But once again, weather is not climate. The Nobel Prize winners continue. The importance of leadership in the coming few years cannot be understated. Governments are lagging scandalously behind what science demands and what a growing and powerful people-powered movement knows is necessary. There is enough carbon embedded in already operating oil, gas, and coal fields and mines to take us beyond 2C, let alone 1.5C. The implications of this are clear. There is no room for expansion of the fossil fuel sector. There is no room for the tech frontier tar sands mine. Projects that enable fossil fuel growth at this moment in time, or in other words now, are an affront to our state of climate emergency. They're an affront to our state of climate emergency. So this state apparently suffers from amour propre. It's affronted. Climate emergency is affronted by Alberta, Canada, and the tech company. And the mere fact that they warrant a debate in Canada should be seen as a disgrace. So you're not allowed to debate these things because science has determined it. I mean, there's no evidence of it. The models are bogus and the evidence keeps being faked, but science will not be denied. They are wholly incompatible with your government's recent commitment to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And with clear infringements on First Nations rights, such projects fly in the face of rhetoric and purported efforts towards reconciliation. The response to the climate crisis will define and destroy legacies in the coming years. And the qualifications for being on the right side of history are clear. An immediate end to fossil fuel financing and expansion, along with an ambitious and just transition away from oil and gas production towards zero carbon well before mid-century. As recipients of the Nobel Prize, we call on you and your cabinet to act with the moral clarity required by the state of this crisis and reject the proposed tech frontier mine proposal. I'm reminded of a statement supposedly made by Queen Elizabeth the first to an importunate courtier, little man, must is not a word addressed to princes. And there's a list of winners here, a whole bunch of German names in chemistry, someone from economics, John Coetzee, literature, Elfrida Jelinek, literature, Alice Munro, who was actually a Canadian from Victoria. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of names here, including various winners of the Peace Prize. So the scientists have spoken, and they will not be denied. Meanwhile, there is political turmoil in Alberta. This is from Global News. Albertan members of Parliament issued a call to action Thursday, warning that a referendum on independence is inevitable unless the Liberal government steps up and creates constitutional change. The Buffalo Declaration was signed by 4 MPs from Alberta, Michelle Rempel, Blake Richards, Glenn Motz, and Arnold Viersen. Rempel tweeted out the document, writing, "Alberta is not and never has been an equal partner in Confederation. The people of my province are suffering and need real structural change. A line in the sand must be drawn." That either this happens or a referendum is inevitability. It is not our job to explain Alberta's value. It is now up to Canada to show they understand Alberta and our value to Confederation. Lydia Miljan, a University of Windsor political science professor, said that the declaration is likely an attempt to get Canadians talking about the problems facing Alberta. She noted the declaration pointed to largely deeper problems within Canada's makeup rather than a specific government. Historically, it's been Ontario and Quebec that have called the shots, and the periphery, they've had much more difficulty getting their culture and their way of life recognized. They're essentially saying if Alberta gets to call the shots on, say, immigration and cultural policy, why can't other parts of the country? That's why Miljan said she believes a referendum on separation would have strong support in Alberta and Western Canada in general, despite being very divisive across the country. A different professor, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, Christo Ivalis, said separating is not an easy process. It's not a quick process. It could take years and years and years to figure out. And by then there could be an election where a pro-Western party, under their definition, or a pro-Western prime minister takes power. And maybe they wouldn't want to separate anymore. Yeah, the same claims were made about Brexit and what happened there. Western alienation has been of growing concern following the October 2019 federal election, with some even floating the term Wexit, Western Canada's exit from Canada. Behind the movement is a sentiment that the federal government for years has ignored Western economic and social interests. And there's a link here to an interview with a woman called Kim Campbell. I knew Kim Campbell a little bit when she was still a Vancouver politician. She was a guest host for my radio program for a week. Incredibly, this woman, Brian Mulroney, who was prime minister at the time and wanted to retire, this is in 1984, decided that this woman must be prime minister, that it was time for Canada to have a female prime minister. And so all of the heavyweights in the Conservative Party decided that they weren't going to run against her. In fact, Jean Charest from Quebec, Mulroney had to pretty much beg him to provide a token opposition. And Kim Campbell's campaign for the leadership was so disastrous that if it had gone on for another week, she would have lost. She led the Conservative Party into an election in 1984, not 1984, in 1993. The Conservatives had elected 169 MPs in the previous election, and under Kim Campbell, this was reduced to 2. No, I didn't misspoke. 1, 2. That's how much of a disaster Kim Campbell was as a politician. But I will note that Lydia Miljan, she's quite correct to use the example of Quebec, that from the 1960s onwards, Quebec said, give us stuff. give us more stuff or we will leave. And the reaction of Canadians generally, as well as the elite, was, okay, what do you want? Tell us what you want and we will give it to you. And this blackmail bribery game has been going on for decades with no end in sight. Now, Quebec is the biggest beneficiary of our equalization program. Effectively, it's Western Canadian money that keeps Quebec a going concern. Without the money from Western Canada, living standards in Quebec would collapse. There would probably be a mass depopulation of the province. But when Quebec speaks, the elite listens. When Alberta speaks, Alberta is told to shut the hell up. And Albertans are not willing to do that anymore. They've had it. I mean, it's one thing to be economically exploited, but it's another thing to be insulted into the bargain. And this is what the Eastern Canadians simply do not understand. They think they can both steal Alberta's money and tell them they should be grateful for what they are allowed to keep. I'm told that my sound is not optimal. Okay. Let me try this. Is that any better? Let me know in the chat. Let's see. What is the chat talking about? Oh, yes. Is that an SCTV box behind me? Yes, it is. SCTV is maybe my favorite ever television program. It's I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It ran in the it ran from roughly 1976 to 1985, and it was not a live show like Saturday Night Live is, and that's one of the reasons why SCTV was just streets ahead of Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live, with a live audience, there's a strong tendency to go for the cheap laugh. And once having got the cheap laugh, to repeat the same joke over and over and over again. And SCTV built up a fictional universe based in the town of Melonville, where they had all of these characters that were created, interacted with each other in different ways. And I would say that the first Christmas episode of SCTV, which sort of brings together a lot of story threads that have been happening in the season, is probably the greatest 90 minutes of television in history. So let's see. I didn't get any response as to my question as to whether the sound is better. Let's see. Good to see you branching out. You should line up some guests. Yeah. Okay. Yes, that is in the future. It will be coming. I hope to have Matt Fay on next Thursday to discuss Under the Sun of Satan. So what's up next? Let's talk about American politics. There's one more thing that I wanted to mention with regard. Oh, yes. This is important. There are people in the United States who call themselves conservatives who, belong to what has been called the conservative movement. And these people are on the outs now, and they're not happy about it. I'll get to one of their responses recently. But the leading conservative pundit in Canada is a man called Andrew Coyne. And Andrew Coyne is in no way conservative. He is an extreme rationalist, an extreme individualist who doesn't really believe in society. And oh, he's about to, this morning in the Globe and Mail, which amusingly, some decades ago was referred to as the newspaper for the gay stockbroker, he has a lecture on the law for us. When it comes to blockades, the rule of law is about more than rules or laws. Ooh, wow, that's some heavy ambiguity going on there. On Wednesday morning, a small group of protesters calling themselves the Cousins, with two Zs, for Wet'suwet'en erected a makeshift barricade at a CN rail crossing in Edmonton. By midday, an even smaller group of counter-protesters converged on the site and dismantled the barricade, carrying its pieces off in a pickup truck. Neither group was, strictly speaking, acting either inside or outside the law. We're into Schrodinger's cat territory here. No court injunction had been issued against the protesters at the time the counter-protesters moved in. The latter committed no violence against the former. And yet it is plainly contrary to the norms of society governed by law for private individuals either to forcibly block rail lines or to forcibly prevent others from blocking them. Wow, just the ambiguity here. It's killing me. No bloodshed resulted in this case, but it's not hard to imagine how it might have had the same thing if it had been attempted against, say, the Mohawks blocking trains in Ontario and Quebec. That did not stop a number of the louder advocates of the rule of law, and there are scare quotes around rule of law, in the current crisis, including the former Minister of Justice and current Conservative leadership candidate Peter MacKay, in a since-deleted tweet, from hailing the pickup truck vigilantes for quite literally taking the law into their own hands. Yeah, the hypocrisy here is astonishing. You have one group of people taking the law into their own hands, and the police, provincial police and or federal police, refuse to follow the law. They refuse to follow court orders. But when a group of people take down a barricade blocking rail traffic, well, that's unforgivable. That is vigilantism. Let's see. For their part, the leaders of a protest explicitly rejecting police authority over the Wet'suwet'en, or presumably themselves, were heard complaining that the police were doing nothing to protect them. It would appear that both sides are in need of a little refresher course in the rule of law, a defining characteristic of which that it applies equally to all. On the left, the crisis has brought forth a flurry of essays on the theme of the rule of law as instrument of colonialist oppression. But the merits of the rule of law as a principle of government are distinct from those of any particular law or its application. The rule of law is also represented by the string of landmark Supreme Court rulings that have advanced Indigenous rights, as well as the constitutional documents going back to the Royal Proclamation of 1763. If you want the law's protection, you also have to accept the law's authority. Yes, what the Supreme Court of Canada has done, well, just a little background here. Canada got a revised constitution in 1982, which included the so-called Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this specifically in Section 15 explains that there are two groups of people in Canada. There are protected classes, various minorities, and everybody else. And affirmative action, that is to say, an absence of equality before the law, is written directly into our Constitution. So if anyone tells you about, equality in Canada, the best response would be to laugh into their face. Shortly after, a few years after 1982, the Supreme Court announced that it had awarded to itself the power to read into the Constitution certain things that were not in the Constitution. To give one example, a well-known homosexual MP, Sven Robinson from Burnaby, had asked Jean Chrétien, who later Prime Minister, who was at the time the Justice Minister, to include homosexuality as a protected class. And something like 13 times Jean Chrétien said no. Well, about a decade after that, Supreme Court read in homosexuality as a protected class. They read in a universal right to abortion. They read in a right to euthanasia and to prostitution. And just yesterday, a superior court in Canada said that any restrictions on prostitution. That is to say, an open escort service. Well, that was illegal too. Supreme Court makes the law up as it goes along. In fact, some years ago, the Chief Justice at the time that Canada's abortion law was overthrown confessed to an audience of law students at the University of British Columbia that he really couldn't find any constitutional justification for throwing out Canada's abortion law. He just thought that it was a good idea. And this is Andrew Coyne is of the belief that Canada was refounded in 1982. That Canada was apparently a very dark and dangerous, a bad place before 1982. But now we have the Charter of Rights. Oh, and by the way, the Supreme Court ruled that truth is not a defense to an accusation of hate speech. I'll run that by you again. Truth is not a defense to an accusation of hate speech. So effectively, there is no free speech in Canada. But let's go back to Pastor Coyne here. The vulnerability of Canadian infrastructure to activist hijacking may be annoying and it may be frustrating, but it is a reality. The tendency of so many conservatives to wish away what is unpleasant to behold, indulging instead in wild fantasies of what is possible by enforcement, the border crosser issue is another example, is one of many pathologies currently afflicting the movement. So is a taste for inflammatory rhetoric and needless, almost reflexive polarization, always dangerous, but particularly toxic when issues of race are engaged. The Liberal government may be fairly criticized for helping to create the current situation or for being slow to resolve it, but at least it is not acting in a way as to make it vastly worse. Can conservatives claim the same? This is the principle which I referred to the other day in an essay by Jennifer Ditchburn, that effectively for Canadians to call for the law to be upheld, well, besides being racist and the like, it's also deeply un-Canadian. You see, this is how my country works. That things get turned upside down, and we're told this new thing is now Canadian, and if you are against it, now you weren't involved. There was no discussion. This is the way we do things now, and just keep silent because otherwise you will be un-Canadian. A traitor. And by the way, Canada was never a legal country anyway. Canada was a country built on lies and thefts, falsehood. And as I mentioned earlier this week, this kind of glasnost, if you will, regarding Canadian history, well, Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union in 1985, and by 1991, 6 years later, there was no more Soviet Union. And Trudeau has been in power for 5 years now, not quite 5 years. Let's see whether he manages to beat Gorby's record. So I want to go back to the chat for a moment. Let's see. How about a blue screen with a nice graphic to get things going? Yes, I'm looking into that definitely. And also the ability to play videos and put up pictures and all that sort of stuff. I'm going to be thrashing this out this weekend. Pipe. Yeah, I've never been attracted to the idea of pipe smoking. I like the idea that, I throw away the detritus when I'm done. I don't, not constantly drawing on it. No. I've known people who've smoked pipes, and I think a lot of them are attracted to the ritual of it. You need to buy all of these different things, and you got to clean the thing out and clean the stem and all that. It seems like an awful lot of trouble. Let's see. Coming up next. Oh, yes, Donald Trump. Donald Trump, he had some things to say about movies particularly the most recent Oscars. According to Associated Press, President Donald Trump is apparently not a fan of Oscar winner Parasite, his biggest complaint being that the movie was made in South Korea. Trump started talking about the Academy Awards during a campaign rally in Colorado Springs, Colorado on Thursday night. Parasite was named Best Picture, the first non-English language film to get the top honor. What the hell was that about? Trump said. We got enough problems with South Korea on trade. On top of that, they gave them Best Movie of the Year. Was it good? I don't know. So Trump likes the old-timey movies. The audience booed when Trump mentioned the Academy Awards and then cheered when he said, "Can we get like Gone with the Wind back, please? Sunset Boulevard, so many great movies." Yeah, he said, "Look, I get along great with South Korea, but I never saw that one before." I don't have any problem with Parasite winning the best picture at the Oscars. I don't think that there's any necessity for an American film to be chosen. But what people forget about Trump is that he's a provocateur. He's always trolling people. He's really, besides being a leader, he's also a fine comedian. He's always looking to get a rise out of certain people, and my God, does he get it. Gone with the Wind, which I discussed on a previous Theater Thursday, is a fine film. But on Twitter last night, all these very famous people, Larry Sabato and some guy who used to write speeches for the Clintons, that, they were talking about how the movie whitewashes slavery, or it's a paean to slavery, that it's patronizing towards black people. And the fact that Trump loves Gone with the Wind is indicative of his deeply rooted white supremacy. It's another dog whistle and all such nonsense. My message to these people, well, here's the first thing that came to mind. I would guess that 95% of the people who are railing against Gone with the Wind have never seen the movie. It is the most popular film in history, but it was made in 1939, and most young people do not like watching old movies. The vast majority of the people criticizing Trump for his taste in movies wouldn't be caught dead watching a movie that didn't have men wearing spandex or wizards in it. There's a difference between art and sociology. Gone with the Wind happens to take place. It begins immediately before the Civil War breaks out in 1861 and continues through to the bleak early days of Reconstruction. One of the criticisms of the film was that it was all about the patriarchy. This person has clearly not seen Gone with the Wind, because Gone with the Wind is the story of a woman called Scarlett O'Hara, a woman who has every man that she meets from her father on down wrapped around her little finger. Every man but one, a man called Rhett Butler. It's really a story of survival, of desperation, and it's a story of foolishness as well, because Rhett Butler, in one of the first scenes of the movie, he tells a bunch of Confederate patriots that they don't know what they have gotten themselves into, that the South's economy simply cannot compete with the North's, and the North will win, which is precisely what happened. There is one of the most famous scenes in cinema where you see wounded people on the ground in Atlanta, and the camera pulls back, and then you just see that there are thousands upon thousands of people. As a Confederate flag flies in the foreground, showing the enormous sacrifice brought about by the vainglory of men. That, people are upset by Gone with the Wind because the O'Hara family owned slaves, and that for the most part, after the end of slavery, they remained with the family. Well, there were slaveholders, I suppose, were a varied lot. Some of them were cruel to their slaves, some of them were not. The O'Hara family is shown to be very close to their slaves, particularly the character played by Hattie McDaniel, who won an Oscar for her performance. And this black woman is, she's a strong woman, and we're supposed to like strong women in films. She is determined, and she is the real boss of the household. It's a really deep and rich part. But oh yes, bad things happened in the past, and any movie that maybe they would like Gone with the Wind better if every 5 minutes there was a title card that said slavery. Wow, can you believe that ever happened? Was that evil or what? Just repeat that every 5 years, as well as a disavowal that the filmmakers do not in any way endorse the institution of slavery, which was detestable everywhere and always. But as I say, Trump is a provocateur, and I think he knew exactly what was going to happen. What was going to happen? Now, as I mentioned earlier, the conservative movement is on the outs in the United States. And this is a good thing, because the conservative movement was, as I've mentioned before, it was an attempt to create, a successful attempt to create a political alliance between left and right. The right said to the left, we'll essentially give you whatever you want domestically in exchange for your support of a strong stand against communism, Cold War. Well, in 1991, Soviet Union collapsed, and the conservative movement should have been wrapped up at that time, because essentially it no longer had any reason to exist. But that would have meant that a large number of people would, well, not a large number of people, a few hundred, a few thousand people would have lost their comfortable jobs, would have had to, move on, do something else. It's a curious thing to me that even during the height of the Cold War, and I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, people seem to hate Russia now more than they hated the Soviet Union. Now, one reason for that is that a lot of people on the left, or people who call themselves liberals, had a rather sneaky, favorable feeling towards the Soviet Union. I mean, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, right? Sure, there are excesses, but, they're trying to build a better society. And so the conservatives have decided, that they're going to push back against Trump. The Weekly Standard, sadly, closed down, but they have their their handbills now. And Bill Kristol, he's not going to give up the fight. He's left the Republican Party, which is another, that's a great signal. And he's pretty much come out like all of these principled conservatives in admitting that they are not, in fact, conservative. They are liberal. Coming up on February 29th in Washington, D.C., the Summit on Principled Conservatism. Stand Up Republic, Principles First. And the graphic is a picture of Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial. When I was a young man reading the conservative literature, Abraham Lincoln was a deeply controversial subject. That there were, I was perhaps the majority view that Lincoln was not, in fact, a good man or a good president. But now Lincoln, along with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, has become a hero of conservatism. So Principles First, in partnership with Stand Up Republic, is excited to announce a one-day grassroots Summit in Washington, D.C. on February 29th focused on reviving principled conservatism in the United States. We look forward to bringing together conservative speakers, thought leaders, and grassroots activists for a day of panels, speeches, networking, and substantive discussion about what conservatism means today and where the conservative movement must go from here. This promises to be an exciting, first-of-its-kind event. The speakers lined up for this gathering will be some of the leading thinkers in the principled lane, and many of our Principles First grassroots activists from around the country are planning to travel in for the day. It will be the first time in some time that much of the principled conservative movement has gathered in one place. Other gatherings are hosted in fancy hotels and cost hundreds of dollars to attend. Ours will be different. We're charging each attendee a small nominal fee, $10, merely to ensure attendance and provide accurate headcount estimates. Principles First is a completely volunteer organization. No one makes a dollar off our activism. This is about our ideas, and we want everyone to attend who can. Okay, so you might have noticed something missing from this description. What is principled conservatism? I can tell you what principled conservatism is. It's essentially losing with good grace and being paid to lose. Donald Trump was not supposed to be nominated in 2016 by the Republican Party. Unlike all recent nominees of the Republican Party for president, Donald Trump did not run as a conservative. And that shows that he is a smart man. Because conservatism is a busted brand. Oh, what are we going to complain? We're going to complain about abortion, but then not do anything about it, say? Of course, I think they may have moved on from that. David A. French, who was one of the leading principled conservatives, has acclaimed Drag Queen Storytime as an outstanding example of American liberty or some such. That it's a curious thing that also that Donald Trump, we know is a rather louche figure, a roue, but the pro-lifers, the anti-abortion people, they quite like him because he has made it clear that he is quite sincere in his dislike of abortion. It's not pro forma with him. And, the feeling is reciprocated. So who are the confirmed speakers? Oh, Mona Charen. This woman's been around forever. I don't believe she's ever said anything memorable. Bill Kristol. Well, of course, Bill is going to be there. Rick Wilson. He's that scary-looking fellow who appears on MSNBC joking about, Americans, Trump supporters. They're all rubes. They're all stupid. He's a political consultant. That is to say that he has been paid lots of money for losing for decades. Tom Nichols, Major Tom, who believes, again, that, Republicans, people on the right, they're stupid. They're deeply stupid people. They don't go to universities, or they don't go to the right universities, and they don't live in big cities. They don't live in bug hives. So, they're just terrible, terrible people. David Frum is going to be there, the great Canadian, the author of the phrase axis of evil, who for some reason was not laughed out of town after the fiasco of the American occupation of Iraq. Evan McMullen, or Egg McMuffin, as he's called, he ran for president in an effort, I suppose, to take a Utah away from Trump. Didn't work. Charlie Sykes, the erstwhile, aka failed talk show host. Ramesh Ponnuru. What was San Francis's joke that you people read National Review to have a bunch of Indians tell them what America's really all about? Will Wilkinson. Will Wilkinson is a libertarian or a liberal-tarian. He is a deeply committed enemy of tradition in all of its aspects. Mindy Finn, I don't know, was she Egg McMuffin's Veep candidate? So, what are they going to talk about? First up, what is principled conservatism? And then the politics of conservatism. Should we stay or should we go? Go. Please, go. Conservatism in the world, foreign policy and trade. Okay, I got a pretty good idea. Bomb, 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 all of these countries. Also sign free trade deals with everyone. There's still too many Americans with high-paying jobs, and conservatism is all about putting your countrymen out of work, or reducing their wages to a subsistence level. The Constitution and the rule of law, oh boy, that is going to be arch. No question about it. Oh, that Trump threatens the Constitution. He's a wrecker of the Constitution. Well, going back to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, at the very least, the Supreme Court has been trampling America's Constitution, but they don't really, these principled conservatives don't really seem to have a problem with that. And then finally, the future of conservatism, looking ahead. Yes, they don't really have much to look forward to. I wanted to say something about Joe Biden. Joe Biden has, he's clearly senile, but now he seems to be drifting into outright mania. As Brittany Hughes reports, former Veep Joe Biden is now bizarrely claiming he was arrested with the UN ambassador trying to visit Nelson Mandela in South Africa back in the 1970s. There's just one problem. The UN ambassador at the time says he doesn't recall ever being arrested with Biden, and neither does anyone else. This day, 30 years ago, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison and entered into discussions about apartheid, Biden said in South Carolina last week, repeating a story he's told at least 3 times on the campaign trail. I had the great honor of meeting him. I had the great honor of being arrested with our UN ambassador on the streets of Soweto, trying to get to see him on Robbins Island. I think that, wait another week, that Biden will be claiming that he actually was in prison with Nelson Mandela. According to the New York Times, Biden's never mentioned this alleged arrest, which you'd think would be a pretty prominent story in his record before. But if Mr. Biden, then a U.S. Senator from Delaware, was in fact arrested while trying to visit Mandela, he did not mention it in his 2007 memoir when writing about a 1970s trip to South Africa, and he has not spoken of it prominently on the 2020 campaign trail. A check of available news accounts by the New York Times turned up no references to an arrest. South African arrest records are not readily available in the United States. Well, I'll say this. If a serving United States senator was arrested in a foreign country, that would be the leading item on the news. It would be a front page story in every newspaper. Andrew Young, who was UN ambassador at the time, said he was never arrested, and to his knowledge, neither was Biden. Now, people were being arrested in Washington. I don't think there was ever a situation where congressmen were arrested in South Africa, again, because, the whole world would know about it. Joe Biden, I guess maybe he's got to a point where he's not capable of realizing that he is being humiliated. That, he was the front runner. It was his turn. And then I guess the joke is that Joe Biden was being pushed as a presidential candidate solely so that the House could impeach Donald Trump over the Ukraine. And how did that work out? I know that you all loved Russiagate, so you'll be pleased to find out that Russiagate is back. Yes, we heard for 3 years these terrifying tales about how Vladimir Putin had hijacked the Trump campaign, that Trump was a stooge of Putin, that there was this enormous interference by Russia, that Russia stole the 2016 presidential election. Strangely, the Democrats did not put any of this in their bill of particulars for impeachment. From the New York Times, House is warned that Russia is meddling to re-elect Trump. The intelligence official's disclosure is said to have angered President Trump, who complained that the Democrats would weaponize it. Days later, Trump said he was replacing the interim director of national intelligence with an aggressively vocal supporter. Jim Kunstler comments, "We're reminded this morning by the New York Times, America's official psychotic fantasy generator, that the Russians are coming again as an ad hoc arm of the committee to re-elect Trump." You have to ask yourself, does Trump actually need their help? His opponents have been self-meddling so diligently that their party now looks like a Frankenstein creature assembled from the spare parts of Herbert Marcuse, Tupac Shakur, Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, and Jamie Gum. Imagine that monster running a government. If Vlad Putin happened to express an aversion to the idea at an international cocktail party, can you really blame him? Plenty of Americans surely feel the same way. Anyway, the Times story never gets around to saying much about the alleged new Russian campaign besides this, quote, "They have made more creative use of Facebook and other social media. Rather than impersonating Americans as they did in 2016, Russian operatives are working to get Americans to repeat disinformation," the official said. That strategy gets around social media's companies' rules that prohibit inauthentic speech. Disinformation means claims or opinions that the elite does not agree with. It's that simple. Oh, these debunked conspiracy theories that the Ukraine had something to do with the coup d'etat against Trump. Debunked by whom? By those people who have a vested interest in the truth not being told? Anyway, Kunstler continues, wow, that's pretty scary, except when you consider that Americans have done a crackerjack job of mind-fucking themselves with disinformation the past several years, coincidentally via this very New York Times, a figment machine so demented that it has come to resemble the proverbial crazy ant locked in the attic. The true wonder is the Times' poverty of imagination, reviving a tattered cockamamie story that bombed abjectly the first time around. I suppose in a culture addicted to stupid sequels, they expect Robert Mueller will be called back on duty to sort this one out, like he did so nicely before. Actually, you could make a credible argument that the vaunted U.S. intel community is a bigger threat to American life than anything the Russians might do on Facebook. Hence the good news that Trump has appointed Ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, to the pivotal job as Director of National Intelligence, a position created in 2004 to supposedly coordinate the far-flung activities of 17 armies of spooks and snoops, lately notorious for feeding disinformation to the New York Times and its Resistance media allies. Note right off the bat, the Washington Post characterized Grenell as a partisan propagandist seeking to disable him from the get-go. One could easily assume that the officers of the 17 intel agencies will do everything possible to work around Grenell, but he does have the power to ask questions and to ask additionally the reason why he isn't getting straight answers, and then to do something about it. Of course, that's exactly what La Résistance is afraid of. It was Grenell's predecessor, Joseph McGuire, who fecklessly allowed the whistleblower and that phantom's enabler, ICIG Michael Atkinson, to play the nation on Ukraine Gate, a hideously embarrassing episode of engineered political subterfuge that instigated the grave process of impeachment so that the whole world could see exactly how dishonest we are amongst themselves. More proof that we don't need Russia's help by sowing disorder and ignominy in our own country. And then he talks about General Flynn, who he describes as the American Dreyfus, an honorable Army officer dragged through the muck unjustly by the intel community, working 6 days from Sunday, in the immortal words of Senator Chuck Schumer, to prevent its dirty laundry from being aired. His ordeal has gone on for 3 years and is coming close to climax. The legal devices used to screw General Flynn are known to the public now, including the initial deceitful interrogation by FBI agents Strzok and Piętka, the withholding of exculpatory evidence by his prosecutors and plenty of other misconduct, and the unethical behavior of his former lawyers from the swamp firm of Covington and Burling. He's going to eventually get off this ignoble rap sooner or later, one way or another. Silencing him was probably the key objective in the long train of seditions that I sum up as Cougate. Now, he brings up something very interesting and mysterious. How is it that General Flynn ended up with lawyers who do not seem to have been working on his behalf? And one might ask a similar question of Roger Stone's lawyers. That it turns out that the foreperson of the jury that convicted him was a prominent Democratic activist who hates Trump with a passion and has been telling the whole world of this on social media for years. And she was asked about her political opinions. Did she have any strong opinions about Trump? And, oh, yes, I gaze at the news from time to time, that sort of thing. In other words, she lied. Now, did Roger Stone's lawyers not do a social media search of this woman? And if not, why not? Did Roger Stone's lawyers decide that they were going to throw the case? I think that there are several state bar associations that might take an interest in the cases of General Flynn and Roger Stone. So let's see. KMG was great as the villain in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. I don't think I'm quite that deathly looking. I love that character. He's so funny. You know, the accent, you know, when they Bill and Ted have to play these games, you know, they choose the games and they win each one, you know, best 2 out of 3, best 3 out of 5, etc. And after Death admits he's been defeated, they congratulate him, you know, for his valiant efforts, especially considering your totally heavy death robes. And he turns around and says, "Don't patronize me." Very funny. Very, very funny. Okay, so what do we got next? Yes, we talked about Russiagate 2.0. Here's a story from England. It's reported by the Daily Mail. Oxford University proposes dropping twin classic texts Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid from classic syllabus in bid to modernize and attract more state school pupils. Okay, how can you modernize the classics? I mean, it's there in the name, right? And why are they so eager to attract more state school pupils? And I see that the planted axiom there is, I guess, that state school pupils are a bunch of dummies who could not possibly have any interest in the ancient world and its literature. Virgil's Aeneid and Homer's Iliad may be made optional in an attempt to modernize the degree course amid a drop in schools teaching Latin and Greek. But undergraduates say that the works are vital to understanding the project. Jan Price, a second year at New College and president of the Oxford Latinitas Project, has started a petition to keep the texts. Removing Homer and Virgil would be a terrible and fatal mistake, he said. The proposal would mean that Oxford would be producing classicists who have never read Homer and never read Virgil, who are the central authors of the classical tradition and most of classical literature. Removing it would be a shame because Homer has been the foundation of the classical tradition since antiquity, and it is impossible to understand what comes after him without studying him first. Classics professor Jonathan Pragg said no decision had been taken on the proposal, which would see the text dating from between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago reduced to a second-year option in a bid to help students who had not previously studied Latin and Greek. He said that the course is designed to be equally stimulating and engaging for all types of applicant. Adding, the process of review has involved extensive analysis of course data and discussions across the faculty and has been underway for almost a year. A survey has been conducted of faculty members and a survey of undergraduate members is likely to follow. And in that context, we welcome all contributions to the ongoing discussions. Dr. Daisy Dunn, a historian and author who read classics at Oxford, said axing the text was a terrible idea. She added that the move would be like cutting the Bible from theology, reports the Telegraph. Students who study classics at Oxford call the first 2 years of their lessons mods, while the 2 final years of the degree are known as the greats. And there was a time when businessmen were told that who are the best people to hire for your business? And they were told great students, those who had studied the classics. But so they're polling the undergraduates to, how dumbed down do you want a classics degree at Oxford to be? Maybe, the undergraduates would prefer to be able to get degrees in Harry Potter studies, say, because that's a modern day classic, right? So who has studied classics at Oxford? Boris Johnson was at Balliol. Oscar Wilde was at Magdalen College. He studied there. C.S. Lewis, again at Magdalen College. And J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm reminded of the woman who wrote that book, Lean In, Sherry something or other, I think her name was, that she confessed that when she was at Harvard, she was asked to write, I believe, a 5-page essay on the Iliad. And she confessed that she'd never heard of the Iliad, let alone read it. And that 5 pages, wow, that's really long. And so what were the connections that got her into Harvard in the first place? Because it doesn't sound like Harvard material. How could you have not heard of the Iliad, assuming that you're reasonably intelligent and you have some engagement with culture? That you've never heard of the term Achilles' heel? You'd never heard of Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships? You'd never heard of the Trojan horse? Now, I'm sure that she did hear of the Trojan horse, but it seems to me that one of the differences between people who should go, who could benefit from university, and those who don't, is that one hears an intriguing phrase such as Trojan horse. And so, these days you can look up anything on Wikipedia, or, when she was growing up, doubtless she would have had a World Book Encyclopedia or Encyclopedia Britannica in the home, and she would have looked it up and read about the Trojan horse. And like most people, she would have said, my word, that was a clever idea. But no, apparently, it's possible to be a complete ignoramus with no interest in culture and find yourself as a student at Harvard and Oxford, which raises the question, what exactly is the purpose of these institutions today? Yes, obviously, getting a degree from these places, or even being accepted at them, is pretty much a guarantee that one is going to be successful later in life. But isn't the ostensible goal of these institutions to mold minds, to bring, the best in people to the surface, by arming them with knowledge of the earth, its people, its culture, et cetera, from the very earliest times to today? I mean, what do they do there? I'm sure there's lots of people at Oxford and Harvard talking about Latinx queer studies and the like, but I don't see how that advances knowledge in any way at all. I simply don't get it. But the Daily Mail is the newspaper, as I said earlier this week, that prints the news about America that American newspapers or media outlets are too ashamed to print. But it's also a daily record of the decline of a once great country. It's also a chronicler of excess, celebrity excess. And for those reasons, I suppose it's a difficult read. Oh, I should say something about Mike Bloomberg. that someone has told Mike Bloomberg that apparently the left can't meme. That's a meme itself. And so Mike has hired, doubtless for top dollar, the toppermost dollars, an army of meme makers. So, just because he's almost 80 doesn't mean that he's not, hip to what the kids are saying on the internet. So Trump had a rally in Phoenix this week. This is a tweet from Team Bloomberg. We made sure there was a nice gift waiting for him. And there's a billboard. It says, Donald Trump eats burnt steak. Mike Bloomberg likes his medium rare. Paid for by Mike Bloomberg 2020. What? What? Wow, that's just Mike Bloomberg. He's not just, a billionaire. Not just a man with $60 billion. He's not just the former mayor of New York City. He is a world-class purveyor of snark as well. That's going to bring the voters in. Someone called Chris Arnade comments, "This is like drama club try and fight the football team." Yes, I suppose it is. They put Bloomberg's face on the side of an apple or something like that. Look at all these cute things we got Mike Bloomberg doing. Are you excited yet? This is going to be the most social media friendly campaign ever. In fact, since Mike Bloomberg seems to, the more people see him, the more they dislike him, outside of New York City at any rate, perhaps there's no need for him to appear in public at all. I mean, he's already spent $400 million on commercials, and he has all these edgy tweets and billboards. Why do we need to see Mike? Maybe, Mike is best understood, not as a man, approaching the age of 80, but more of a spirit, a geist, an entity of some sort. Okay, let's talk about the boomers. And this is from a site called Captain Capitalism. Never trust anybody over 30. It's an excerpt from the book How Not to Become a Millennial that discusses how the boomer adage, never trust anybody over 30, has come to bite them in the ass. The millennials didn't grow up in a vacuum. They weren't born in the Cabbage Patch, sprouted legs one day, and then poof, 22 years later, found themselves $120,000 in debt with a master's degree in diversity and inclusion. Like everyone else, they were a product of their environment. And a huge part of that environment, if not the most influential part, was the elders who would raise them. Parents, teachers, professors, guidance counselors, therapists, bosses, even politicians and media personalities would directly and indirectly wield incredible, if not total, influence over the millennials and would be the single most determining variable in how the millennials would turn out. This is the way it always has been throughout human history because there's no other way for it to be. Younger generations have to be raised by older generations, but the millennials were going to be raised by a very unique generation of elders, a generation of elders that the world had never seen before in terms of its wealth, stability, pampering, and privilege. Nor had the world seen such an arrogant, self-important, completely delusional, and completely wrong generation before. And it was this generation that was going to prepare the millennials for the real world, the baby boomers. Don't you just hate them? Now, it seems to me that, this Generation Z, whatever you want to call it, is a generation which has not been raised by its elders. That is it has largely been self-raised through social media and the like. That I don't think that children are getting much guidance from their parents these days in any respect, except of course, to be, really successful, and that you're a total genius, you're a rock star, you're the greatest child in the world, and don't let anyone tell you different. Back to the essay. What I absolutely love about the baby boomers, what I find so incredibly rich, is how they were the generation that coined the phrase, never trust anybody over 30. And you need to really break down this statement to appreciate how hypocritical, delusional, arrogant, and simply wrong that statement is, and therefore how wrong the baby boomers are. First, boomers said this when they were young, not only stupid, but inexperienced and young. They were a bunch of teenage, 20-something know-nothings who had never worked a job, had yet to start families, draft dodged a war, but somehow they thought they knew better than their elders and the culminated eons of human history. Not only is this against common sense, it's the epitome of hubris and arrogance. Many of them hadn't even gone to college to have a political religion installed in them, so they parrot such outlandish stupidity. They were just naturally stupid and arrogant on their own. And this was the raw material that would go on to raise a generation of children on their own. Second, over 30 meant the World War II generation, implying that generation went through the Great Depression, fought World War II, came back home and built the most successful economy in the history of the world, put a man on the moon, and then as an encore performance during their retirement years, won the Cold War. There's also another generation there, the silents, such as I'm a boomer, born in 1955, a middle boomer, as they say. My father was born in 1931. So the Great Depression is something that he barely remembers, and he was too young to fight in World War II. He was 14 years old when World War II ended. Now, pretty much all of the bad things that are said about the boomers are completely correct. However, let's look at the people who raised us. What were we told when we were young? Well, I can tell you that in my case, and in the case of the people who went to school with me, we were told that essentially there were no serious problems in human life anymore, except for the prevalence of ignorance, of outdated attitudes. Oh, that men and women were equal in every respect, and there was no excuse for any kind of different treatment of men and women. We were told that all men and women are the same under the skin, and that any differences in accomplishment between different types of people can only be the result of racial prejudice. We were given sex education, and we were told that, sex can be used to make babies, but, it's primarily about having fun responsibly. In other words, we were told a pack of lies by our parents, by people who should have known better. But I guess, having conquered the world, that they felt in an expansive mood, we have it good. Why can't everyone else have it good? We'll just throw all this aid at Africa, say, and, in a few years, they'll probably have caught up to us in terms of economic development. Hell, they'll probably have surpassed us in economic development. And so, to me, it is not surprising that the boomers raised the millennial generation, that this decadence only worsens over the years. But, when I think of the phrase never trust anyone over 30, who do I think of? Who comes to mind first? Well, a few people come to mind first. Bill Clinton is one. Hillary Clinton is another. Tony Blair is another one. These were all prominent anti-war protesters. But the funny thing is, Bill Clinton, obviously, he didn't want to go to Vietnam. Hillary Clinton wasn't going to be sent to Vietnam. And Britain didn't fight in the Vietnam War. So, this wasn't really of personal interest to Tony Blair. But the strange thing is that when Bill Clinton came to power, when Tony Blair came to power, suddenly they were all turned around on the subject of war. That previously they had believed, like Justin Trudeau, that when you kill your enemies, they win. But now, apparently, that there is no problem in the world that could not be solved by bombing people. And in fact, these people should be grateful for our attentions. We bomb them because we love them. So what can account for this stunning turnaround? I'd say it's simply a question of whom. That the Vietnam War was not Bill Clinton's war. It was not Hillary Clinton's war. It was not Tony Blair's war. So why did they feel any necessity to support it? Now, when they got the power, they made their own wars. And then it became everyone's responsibility to support their wars. Because, if there's not an endless state of war, an endless state of, foreigners being slaughtered, well, that means that we're being irresponsible. That, we'll bomb the hell out of these people. And, and we'll then import large numbers of them, hoping that they won't hold a grudge against us for bombing the hell out of their countries. Because, why would anyone hold a grudge for that? Let's see, back to the essay. When it came time for the boomers to take stewardship of the United States, they went and completely shat the bed. They inherited the greatest country the world has ever seen, and nearly every capacity destroyed it. Instead of surpluses, they ran massive government deficits. They increased the national debt from 40% of GDP to the current day 106%. Household debt from 40% to 100% GDP. Economic growth tanked from the World War II generation average of 4.25% to 2.25%. And there's their collection of bubbles and financial crises they collected like Pokemon cards, the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, the education bubble, and the Volcker recession, all making genuine economic progress damn near impossible. And this says nothing of the sociological and societal destruction they wreaked upon America: divorce, broken homes, crime, welfare, single motherhood, deadbeat dads, teenage pregnancies, drugs, STDs, and the Doors. A generation could not have failed more at being responsible adults if they tried. Now, I wonder if the author of this essay understands that bubbles and panics, whatever you want to call them, are a persistent feature of capitalism. Now, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, decided he was going to do away with the business cycle. You didn't need the business cycle anymore, so therefore there weren't going to be any more recessions. And how he was going to do this? Was he going to do this? Credit. And so nobody believes that this debt is ever going to be paid back, right? But Greenspan is not a boomer. No, indeed. He is one of the elders from the greatest or silent generations. And it was these elder generations who said things like, well, we owe it to ourselves. Oh, so you can just print money willy-nilly, and that's not going to be a problem because we owe it to ourselves. These are people who decided that that capitalism itself, people save money, step one. Then they loan it to banks at interest, step two. And then the banks loan this money at higher interest to new businesses or developing businesses. That's step three. No. Saving money? Come on, Square. What, are you living in the 1950s or something? Saving money is bad. What? How could saving money be bad? You got to have the liquidity flowing through the economy. Really? Even if it's made up money? Even if it's monopoly money? Even if it's money dropped from helicopters? Yeah, that's right. So it wasn't boomers that came up with this idea. Now, the essayist continues, about the worst thing the boomers did was to shame, mock, and ridicule American culture itself, the pinnacle of human achievement and good. That's a bold statement. The best culture and country the world has ever seen. Another bold statement. The country every other human on the planet desperately wants to move to or become like. And the boomers could not wait to destroy it, throwing it under the bus for such petty reasons as being edgy, to curry favor with anti-American leftists, or to simply fake being some kind of academic or intellectual. In the end, they managed to take the world's greatest asset and in one generation turn it into the world's largest liability. Well, that's not how things work. They don't change like that. You see, I don't think that this fellow, this essayist, has read Christopher Lasch. And if he had read Christopher Lasch, he would have understood that what we're looking at now in America and, the rest of the Western world is the result of a process which has been going on for a century or more. One aspect of it is the replacement of folk wisdom with so-called expertise that parents pass down to their children, who pass down to their children, etc., etc. A way of a sort of holistic view of the world, one might say. This is how children are raised, to give one example. That children are raised primarily by their parents. It is the parents who should be responsible for instilling values in children. And the experts said, no. Parents, they can't be trusted. Some of them are feckless. Some of them are ignorant. Some of them are stupid. We are not feckless, ignorant, or stupid. We're experts, and we know everything about everything. And so we will tell you how your children should be raised. It is the state which is primarily responsible for instilling values in children. And we will turn our schools into laboratories for this purpose. That it's our promise to you that by the time your children graduate from high school, all of those any atavistic ideas they may have inherited from their parents, well, we washed their brains so thoroughly that all that atavism is gone. That if you watch the documentaries of Adam Curtis, particularly The Century of the Self, he explains that consumerism, as we understand it, was invented pretty much by one man called Edward Bernays, who was a relative and friend of Sigmund Freud. He invented public relations. He invented, a science of telling people what they really want and how they should buy products, not because they need them, but because they want them. And the best part is we'll tell you what you want. And so you'll feel good when you buy these products, and you'll feel bad if you don't. You'll feel that you're lacking somehow, that there's a hole in your soul that can be filled only with purchases. I think too much is made of the 1960s in this regard. Let's look at the 1950s, the so-called beatnik generation. All of the attitudes of the 1960s were there amongst these people, and the same social mores were there amongst these people, and there weren't all that many of them. Now, truth to tell, there weren't all that many of them in the 1960s. There were more, but we're talking primarily about university students and students at select universities. Columbia, I could list some names, but there are, I would say, the majority of university students in America in the 1960s, this all passed them by. They weren't interested in it. I suppose to the extent that, getting laid or getting high was part of it. A lot of the students thought that was a good thing. But this really didn't become institutionalized in the United States. It really didn't sink down to the masses until the 1970s. Now, let's see. The boomers, this is the peroration of this essay. The boomers are so bad a generation that instead of commanding the respect eldest generations normally did in the past, they are the butt end of jokes, minimized and completely encapsulated with the simple hashtag of OK Boomer. They are no better than the millennial generation they raised, and their only value in society will be to serve as a warning to others. Well, there's a lot of ruin in a nation, as the saying goes, and there's a lot of ruin in a culture. And look at what intellectuals, American intellectuals, were saying in the 1920s and 1930s. This sort of degradation does not happen overnight. And as I, pointed out a few minutes ago, the boomers, as children, as credulous children, were told a pack of lies by their respected elders. So it's not really a surprise that they ended up as they did. Again, everyone hates the boomers, and I understand why. But I think one needs to be a little more subtle about this. So, people are talking about Pop Smoke in the chat. I don't know whether do I keep up with this kind of stuff. Oh yes, this guy died, and the nation mourns. Really? I mean, how is that possible? They not very many records are sold these days. Of course, people buy tracks instead, I suppose. I don't think that these people are really all that influential. Not as influential as they used to be. Of course, the culture has fragmented. That the Captain Capitalism seemed to have a special hatred for the band The Doors. But imagine if The Doors came out today. Would they have top 10 hits? No, I don't think they would. They would be some sort of indie band, the type that one reads about, a Pitchfork. They certainly wouldn't be the phenomenon today that they were at the time. This is another, this is an enormous change in the culture that seems to be little discussed. That one can hardly speak of a common culture in the West anymore. Now, this, to a large degree, this has to do with choice. That choice is a good thing, right? We're all agreed that the more choice, the better. Well, sometimes it's not such a good thing. That, how can you be influential in society? Who's influential in society? Well, Ariana Grande. One sees pictures of her all the time on the internet, and she's mourning over drug overdose of some drug addicted musician who died, and that sort of thing. Frankly, I don't think that Ariana Grande has any influence at all, and that I think that she will be quickly forgotten. I mean, even Madonna is canceling concerts now because people aren't coming out the way that they used to. Now, Madonna had an extraordinarily long run. I mean, we're talking about over 30 years at the top. But, you get to be as old as Madonna is, and the kids are going to say, we're not interested in what Platinum Grandma has to offer. So I want to talk about, I want to move on to the book club now. And the book this week is The World of Yesterday. And it is written by Stefan Zweig, who, strangely enough, was in the news recently, or a decade ago, the controversy about him, that the acclaimed German translator Mikhail Hoffman called his work just putrid. And Stuart Walton in the Guardian agrees, calling him a pedestrian stylist. I suppose it's better to be attacked than to be ignored. Stefan Zweig was one of the best-selling authors of the world in the 1920s and 1930s, but then his world was turned upside down, which is the reason why he wrote this intellectual memoir, which was completed shortly before his death. Let's see, a recent exchange of hostilities on the letters page of the London Review of Books has prompted a reassessment of the work of one of the early 20th century's most extravagantly popular literateurs, the Austrian-born Stefan Zweig. Extravagantly popular, that is, everywhere but in Britain, where he has hardly been noticed until now, despite having lived here for a while in exile from the Nazi Anschluss. Yes, Viennese bourgeoisie. And yes, and a name dropper, apparently. Well, you see, there are a lot of famous names in this book. I think that if your first editor at Vienna's leading newspaper, the Neue Freie Presse, was Theodor Herzl, I think you'd probably want to mention that. If you were a friend of Walter Rathenau, I think you'd probably mention that. If you were a friend of Rainer Maria Rilke, the great poet, you'd probably mention that. And Zweig had quite a talent for friendship. And he knew many, if not most, of the leading artistic figures of his time. But curious thing about this, to me, this controversy about Zweig, or this attempt by Michael Hoffman to bury his reputation, is that Hoffman has recently been accused of something very serious, that he is the most recent translator of Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel, and he is accused of Baudelairizing it, of removing many passages from it, from his translation, because they are believed, to be too triggering to modern audiences. I'm going to investigate this, and I'll let you know what I come up with. But Stefan Zweig is, he represents a world that has vanished. And that is, to me, one of the reasons why this memoir was so appealing. He came from a world where art was important, where people cared about art, or at the very least they pretended to care about art, where artists were acclaimed figures, acclaimed public figures who were influential in society. And that world is gone. One of the questions raised by his memoir is, I guess it's, Anthony Burgess wrote a whole book on this called The Clockwork Orange. That is appreciation of art the same thing as morality? And of course, Burgess created Alex Delarge to demolish that notion. And obviously, he was thinking of, Germans who spent their days killing people for political reasons, and then went home and relaxed by, listening to a Schubert string quartet and the like. I want to read a passage from this book which tells this story in a few hundred words. That one November day in 1931, I woke up and I was 50 years old. That day was a hard one for our good white-headed Salzburg postman. Since the civilized custom of celebrating a writer's 50th birthday at length in the papers was still practiced in Germany and Austria, the old postman had a considerable number of letters and telegrams to haul up that steep path with all its steps. Before opening and reading them, I thought what this day meant to me. Your 50th year is a turning point. You look back uneasily to see how much of your path you have already trodden and ask yourself privately if it still leads upward. I thought of the time I had lived through. I looked back at those 50 years as I looked from my house at the Alpine range and the valley gently falling away, and I had to admit that it would have been perverse of me not to feel grateful. After all, I had been given far, far more than I had hoped or expected. My wish to develop and express myself through writing works of some literary merit had been granted beyond my wildest childhood dreams. Before me, printed by Insel Verlag as a 50th birthday present, was a bibliography of my published books in all their languages of translation, and it was a book in itself. No important language was missing. They were all there: Bulgarian and Finnish, Portuguese and Armenian, Chinese and Marathi. My words and ideas had reached readers in Braille, in shorthand symbols, and all kinds of exotic characters and idioms. My existence had had immeasurable influence beyond the confines of my own life. I had made friends with many of the finest people of our time. I had seen and enjoyed wonderful artistic performances, immortal cities and pictures, and the most beautiful landscapes in the world. I had remained free, independent of any official position or career. My work was a pleasure to me, and even better, it had given pleasure to others. What could go wrong? Here were my books, and who could do away with them? Or so I asked myself at the time, innocent of any presentiment. Here was my house, and who could drive me out of it? There were my friends. Could I ever lose them? I thought without fear of death and illness, but not the faintest inkling came into my mind of what still lay ahead of me. I had no idea that I would be driven out of my own home, a hunted exile who must wander from land to land over sea after sea, or that my books would be burnt, banned, and despised, my name pilloried in Germany like a criminal's, or that the same friends whose letters and telegrams lay on the table before me would turn pale if they happened to meet me by chance. I did not know that everything that I had achieved by hard work for 30 or 40 years could be extinguished without trace, that my whole life, firmly constructed on sound foundations as it seemed to be, could collapse in ruins, and after nearly reaching the summit, I would be forced to begin again from the beginning, with my powers already weary and my mind disturbed. It was not, to be sure, a day for me to think of anything so absurd and nonsensical. I could be happy. I loved my work, and so I loved life. I was free of care. Even if I never wrote another line, my books would provide for me. I seemed to have achieved a good deal. I had tamed fate. By my own efforts, I had won back the security I had known in my parental home as a child and then lost in the war. What did I have left to wish for? Strange to say, the very fact I could think of nothing left to wish for at that moment made me feel mysteriously uneasy. Would it really be a good thing? Some impulse in me asked, not really my conscious self, for life to go on like this, so calm, well-regulated, financially profitable, and comfortable, without any more tensions or trials? Isn't it, I asked myself, wrong for your real self to be living this secure, privileged life? I walked thoughtfully around my house. Over the years, it had become a beautiful place, just what I had wanted. But all the same, was I always going to live there, sitting at the same desk and writing books, one book and then another, earning royalties and yet more royalties, gradually becoming a dignified gentleman who has to think of his name and his work with decorous propriety, leaving behind everything that comes by chance, all tensions and dangers? Was I always to go on like this until I was 60 and then 70, following a straight, smooth track? Wouldn't it be better for me, so I went on daydreaming, if something else happened, something new, something that would make me more restless, younger, bringing new tension by challenging me to a new and perhaps more dangerous battle? There is always a mysterious conflict in every artist. If life treats him roughly, he longs for peace and calm, but if he comes into safe harbor, he longs to be back in the turmoil. On that 50th birthday of mine then, I had in my heart only the perverse wish for something to happen that would tear me away from all that security and comfort again, would force me not just to go on as I was, but to start again. Was it fear of growing old, weary, and apathetic? Or was it a mysterious foreboding that made me wish on that day for a harder life for the sake of my further development? I don't know. I don't know. For what rose from the twilight of the unconscious mind at that strange hour was not a clearly expressed wish, certainly nothing to do with my conscious will, just a fleeting idea that brushed past me, perhaps not even my own idea, but one arising from depths of which I knew nothing. But the dark power presiding over my life, an intangible power that had already done so much more for me than I would ever have the audacity to wish for, must have sensed it. And that power was already obediently preparing to smash my life to its foundations, forcing me to reconstruct a harsher, harder life from its ruins and rebuild it from the ground up. This translation is by Anthea Bell, and it reads very well. And from the passage that I read, I suppose that viewers can decide for themselves whether Zweig's style is putrid, as Hoffman claims. I suppose, this is styles, literary styles change. And the way that Zweig writes is not typical of writers for the last couple of generations. That doesn't make it any less worthy in my view. Zweig was born in 1881 in Vienna, and he grew up in the haute bourgeoisie, the haute Jewish bourgeoisie of Vienna, and he grew up, of course, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which he deeply loved, and like so many others, he greatly mourned its destruction in 1918. He claims in the book that he had communications with people close to the new emperor, Karl, after the aged Franz Josef had finally died, and that the new emperor was determined to take Germany or Austria out of the war in 1917, but there was a failure of nerve and botched diplomatic communications, and so Zweig is convinced that if Austria had made a separate peace in 1917, it would have been possible to keep the empire together, and I think that he could well be right about that. Now, I mentioned this as intellectual biography. There are indications, say, that at one point in this book, he must be married. It's not a book that goes into that side of his life. It's funny reading this book because, you see a man who is a liberal, who seems to finally come to understanding the dark forces that motivate human behavior. And he is absolutely appalled by this. It's not really surprising. I mean, consider the condition of Europe in 1914. It was wealthier and better educated than at any time in history. That there were rivalries between the European powers, but it was possible for a man like Zweig to travel to Germany, to Italy, to France. He spoke Italian and French fluently, and to travel to Britain and to not feel hostility. He rhapsodizes about the lack of the immigration bureaucracy, but as Enoch Powell said, it really is a question of numbers. Travel was quite expensive in those days, and so you weren't having people deciding to translate themselves halfway around the world in order to find succor from a welfare state, which at the time didn't exist. Zweig criticizes his schooling, which seems to me, in many respects, to have been exemplary, for its formality, for the lack of any kind of real contact between teachers and students. Again, one looks at the situation today, or has it been for several decades, where the students are supposed to be pals with the teacher and vice versa. I don't think that the effects from that have been particularly good. Zweig declares himself to be a kind of enemy of formality in all aspects, and he rails at considerable length over the sexual mores of his society. He makes some wild claims, for instance, in the Austrian countryside, that the majority of births were illegitimate births, and that apparently this wasn't a problem. I don't believe that for a second. One of the reasons why people live in cities, that it is possible to be anonymous, that nobody cares what anyone else does. That is not the case in the countryside, and it certainly would not have been the case in fin de siècle Austria, which at the time was heavily Roman Catholic, and is a time when that religion was taken seriously. That he talks about prostitution, that fornication was dangerous for all sorts of reasons, for social reasons and for medical reasons. That before the invention of antibiotics in the 1930s, syphilis was a death sentence and it was horrifying death. Although I have seen claims made that he talks about how syphilis was treated with mercury, which is a deadly poison. And there are some people who believe that it is actually the mercury that was causing the hair to fall out, the teeth to fall out, tertiary syphilis, what they call general paresis of the insane. You end up blind and mad and in agony. But many of the great composers had syphilis. Schumann, Hugo Wolf, probably Schubert as well. In fact, there's an old joke that of Johannes Brahms as a leader composer that he couldn't have been a very good songwriter. Why is that? Because he never had syphilis. But you see in Zweig a perfect distillation of the liberal dream. That we have progressed, that we have triumphed over all of these obstacles, and we just need a little more progress. And then, we will reach perfection or something close to it. Now, he rails against women's clothing, corsets, and the like. I wonder what Stefan Zweig would have thought about yoga pants, say. Now, do you mean, if you get rid of the excessively formal dress of the time, does that mean it will end up in yoga pants? It would seem to. It would seem to. I remember years ago, there was a controversy at clubs such as the Jockey Club in Vancouver, as to whether, women could wear pantsuits. And the argument was, no, women are not allowed to wear trousers in the Jockey Club. But these are pantsuits. We're not talking about a pair of jeans, And then they allowed the pantsuits, and then pretty much every restriction fell away. I think that Zweig, he was an idealist. And I think he made the mistake of believing that the great mass of people thought as he thought, that he came from a particularly Jewish kind of milieu, as I say, artistic, highly educated, sensitive, and he thought that, perhaps, in good time, everyone can be like this. He talks about, he compares France to Austria, and France is apparently it's a place where anything goes, and people are just so happy there, and just common folk too. One travels, and you need money to travel now, but you need a lot more money then. And typically travelers are looking for the best from the places they go to visit. I mean, why would you go to some place to be miserable, to take back bad memories? And he talks about the French lacking the kind of crippling class consciousness that the Austrians and the Germans have. But then he tells a story which explodes the thesis that he has advanced. I'd been out of Paris for the 2 days of the Whitsun holiday, going away with friends to look around beautiful Chartres Cathedral, which I had not seen before. When I came back to my room on the Tuesday morning, intending to change my clothes, I could not find my trunk, which had been standing in the corner all these months. I went downstairs to see the proprietor of the little hotel, who spent the day taking turns with his wife in the tiny porter's lodge. He was a sturdy, small, red-cheeked man, a native of Marseille. I had often joked with him, and sometimes we had gone to the cafe just opposite to play his favorite game of backgammon. He instantly became very upset, and as he thumped the table with his fist, bitterly uttered the mysterious words, "So that's it." Quickly putting on his coat, for he had been sitting in his shirt sleeves as usual, and changing his comfortable slippers for a pair of shoes, he explained what had happened. And if my readers are to understand it, perhaps I should point to a peculiarity of Parisian buildings. In Paris, the smaller hotels and most of the private houses do not have front door keys, and instead the concierge, that is to say the caretaker, operates the automatic door opener from the porter's lodge as soon as someone out in the street rings the bell. In the smaller hotels and houses, the owner or concierge does not spend all night in the porter's lodge, but can open the door from his conjugal bed by pressing a button, usually while he is still half asleep. Anyone wanting to leave the building has to call "Le cordon, s'il vous plaît." Anyone wishing to enter from outside must call his name so that, in theory, no stranger can steal into the house by night. So at 2 in the morning in my hotel, the bell was rung outside. On coming in, the new arrival gave a name which sounded like that of one of the hotel guests, and he took a key that was still hanging in the porter's lodge. It really should have been the duty of the Cerberus to check the late-night visitor's identity through the glass pane of the lodge, but obviously he had felt too sleepy. However, when the call of "Le cordon, s'il vous plaît" came again an hour later, this time from inside, it struck the proprietor, who had opened the front door once already, that now someone wanted to go out after 2 o'clock in the morning. He had got up, looked down the street, and seeing that someone had just left the hotel with a trunk, set off at once in his dressing gown and slippers to follow the suspicious figure. However, as soon as he saw the man disappear into a small hotel in the Rue des Petits Champs, he naturally concluded that he was not a thief or burglar and went peacefully back to bed. Upset as he was now by his mistake, he hurried off with me to the nearest police station. The police immediately made inquiries at the hotel in the Rue des Petits Champs and found that my trunk was indeed still there, but not the thief, who had obviously gone out to drink his morning coffee in some nearby bar. 2 detectives waited for the villain in the porter's lodge of the hotel, and in half an hour later, when the thief returned, suspecting nothing, he was arrested at once. Now the 2 of us, my landlord and I, had to go back to the police station to be present at the official proceedings. We were taken into the office of the sous-préfet, an extremely stout, mustached gentleman of comfortable appearance who was sitting with his coat unbuttoned on a very untidy desk covered with documents. The entire office smelt of tobacco, and a large bottle of wine on the table showed that the man was by no means one of the more cruelly austere members of the Holy Brotherhood of Peacekeepers. First, the trunk was brought in at his request, and I was asked to look and see if anything important was missing. The only apparent object of value was a letter of credit for 2,000 francs, most of which had already been spent after the months of my stay in Paris, but of course it was of no use at all to anyone else. It sure enough lay untouched at the bottom of the trunk. After a report had been drawn up to the effect that I recognized the case as my property and nothing had been removed from it, the official ordered the thief to be brought in. I looked at him with no little curiosity. And he was worth a look. Between 2 powerful sergeants who made his thin, weedy figure look even more grotesque stood a poor devil, rather shabby and wearing no collar. He had a small, drooping mustache and a sad, visibly half-starved, mouse-like face. Evidently, he was not much of a thief, as witness his error of judgment in failing to make off with the trunk early in the morning. He stood there with his eyes cast down, trembling slightly, as if he were freezing in front of the power of the law, and to my shame be it said that not only did he arouse my pity, I even felt a kind of sympathy for him. And my sympathetic interest increased when a police officer solemnly laid out on a large board all the items that had been found on him when he was searched. A stranger collection can hardly be imagined. A very dirty, torn handkerchief, a dozen duplicate and skeleton keys of all shapes and sizes, jingling musically against each other in a key ring, a shabby wallet, but fortunately no weapon, which at least showed that this thief went about his job in a fairly knowledgeable but non-violent way. First, the wallet was investigated before our eyes. The result was surprising. It did not contain 1,000-franc or 100-franc notes, or indeed a single banknote of any denomination, but held no less than 27 photographs of dancers and actresses in low-cut dresses, as well as 3 or 4 nude photographs. So, Zweig is asked whether he wants to proffer a charge against the thief. And he decides not. You see the liberalism there. That this man, he's quite poor. He's in terrible condition. I'm a wealthy man. And he didn't really take anything from me anyway, so why should I make his life worse? Well, how did the French react to his generosity of spirit? He writes, as soon as I said my decided no, 3 things happened. The thin man between the 2 policemen suddenly straightened up and gave me an extraordinary glance of gratitude, one I shall never forget. The sous-prefet, satisfied, laid his pen down again, and he too was visibly pleased that my decision not to prosecute the thief further saved him any more paperwork. My landlord, however, did not take it in the same way at all. He went scarlet in the face and began shouting angrily at me, saying I couldn't do that. Such scum, cette vermine, had to be exterminated. I had no idea, he told me, of the harm characters of that kind did. A decent man must be on his guard day and night against such rogues, and if you let one of them go, it will only encourage 100 others. He was an explosion of all the upright principles and honesty of a petit bourgeois disturbed while minding his own business, and at the same time showed his pettiness in view of all the trouble the matter had given him. He said, roughly and even menacingly, he insisted on my withdrawing my decision not to prosecute, but I stuck to my guns. So he has made an enemy of the proprietor of his hotel and his wife, and on the street where he lives, none of the businesses, none of the cafes want to have anything to do with him. And he said that this spread throughout the whole district, the greater district, and he felt a need to leave Paris. Now, I mean, you know, one can understand Zweig's generosity, but again, I have to conclude that the shopkeeper is right, that if order is not maintained, it only encourages more disorder. Of course, the greatest disorder of that time was to come in 1914. And whenever I hear people carry on about, you know, white nationalism, I think, yes, let's think about the First World War, the Great War, as they called it, where you had people living in peace and security, getting ever richer with each year. And then for some mysterious reasons, the Europeans decide that what they need is slaughter, mass slaughter, that everyone must kill everyone else in the millions, and that no, none of us is going to blink, because I suppose it would be embarrassing to admit that the whole business had been a mistake. I guess the First World War was Zweig's first clue that the world was not really the same as his liberal fantasies. Zweig wrote poetry. He had his first book of poetry printed when he was 18 years old, and the great composer Max Reger asked if he could set one of his poems to music. Zweig was rather ashamed of his early works. He worked extensively as a translator, and he published essays and novels and history. Mary Stuart, Erasmus, those are two of his most famous biographies. And there's novels, Beware of Pity. He was a librettist for Richard Strauss, and it was a brave decision. It was a brave decision by Strauss. A 1935 opera, which is called Die Schweigsame Frau, the Silent Woman, which is based on Ben Jonson's The Silent Woman. And so Strauss was very friendly with Stefan Zweig, and he was keen to work with him. But of course, Hitler had taken power 2 years earlier, and Strauss was effectively told to kill the opera. That he was told that that Zweig's name could not appear on the program. And Strauss, who was recognized as Germany's greatest composer, perhaps the greatest composer in the world, said no, that his name, Zweig's name, is going to appear on the program. And so there was one performance, and it was effectively mothballed. Meanwhile, the Gestapo had been surveilling both Strauss and Stefan Zweig, and there was correspondence between them in which Strauss said that what was going on in Germany was shameful, that it was an embarrassment to Germany for the world, where he mocked racial theory and he mocked the Nazis. And as the result of this, Zweig became even more notorious in Germany than he had been since Hitler came to power in 1933. His books were banned, and he was not a name to be mentioned in public. Richard Strauss had Jewish grandchildren, and Strauss was dismissed as the Reich music director, and he was essentially kept a hostage until the end of 1945. Zweig was forced to leave Austria with the Anschluss, and he moved first to Britain, and then he moved to a German colony in Brazil, of all places, Petropolis, it's called. He finished the book, The World of Yesterday, and shortly thereafter, he and his wife committed suicide together, killing each other with an overdose of barbiturates. Zweig was a cosmopolitan man, to be sure, but he had a deep love of his homeland, and it would appear that what was seemingly a permanent exile from his homeland was too much for him to bear, notwithstanding the fact that he was stripped of all his possessions. He lost almost everything, and of course his books were not going to be printed in the German-speaking world, and he came to the conclusion that life was no longer worth living. The World of Yesterday is a valediction to a certain type of life, of upper middle class life, a life when the upper middle class had a set of standards that are very different than the standards that obtain today. And in many ways, it is a portrait of a world that is much better than the one in which we live. But again, we end up with this problem of art and its moral value, if any, which is Zweig was mocked for writing this book in 1941, and why? Who cares? The world is at war. The world is on fire. That why are you writing about culture? Why are you writing about poetry? And that strikes me as a very, very stupid question. I remember years ago, a critic for the London Spectator making this very argument about Richard Strauss, that he had written an opera which was basically about the question of art, and Capriccio, and this in 1942. Why, when the world's on fire, why is Strauss writing about art? Well, what better time? What better time? And so I highly recommend Stefan Zweig's intellectual autobiography, The World of Yesterday. It is always good to know, from a man who experienced it widely and is adept at explaining it, how previous people lived. Zweig, despite his recent obscurity, led an extraordinary life. And you read this book and you will come across many, many, many of the great artists of the 20th century. If you have any kind of affinity for Austrian culture, for the old empire, then I would say that this book is a must. And so we come to the end of episode 4 of the KMG Show. Trim those sideburns, Grace. Yes, you're right. Yeah, I gotta do something about my hair. It's getting too long, I suppose. I'm going to do work on the technical side of this show. over the weekend because, of course, I don't have my theme music queued up yet. I've selected it. And there are various bells and whistles that I intend to introduce as soon as possible. And so I'm grateful for people to be putting up with this early trial version of the show. I'm very pleased that, well, at the beginning of the show, at any rate, I already have the 339 subscribers, which is a decent tally, to be sure, for a show that is only 4 days old. I would ask you, if you like the show, to subscribe to my channel. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, that after months of being screwed around by PayPal, my account is now free again, and that viewers who would like to contribute to the show, the email address attached to my PayPal account is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. So now I say good evening to you, and I hope you all have a good weekend, and I'll be back on Monday afternoon.